Joining me now, the man behind this idea, Labor's Nick Champion. He's also the Deputy Chair of the Parliamentary Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee. Nick Champion, thanks for your time this afternoon. It's 4 years since this deal was done with the Chinese-owned land bridge to take control of take a 99-year lease on the Port of Darwin. Has anything particularly happened in the 4 years since this deal that's concerned you?
Well, obviously the geopolitics of the region are slowly changing, I think for the worse, and most of us have observed there's a move away from the rules-based order, and as that's happened, I guess, people have become more and more concerned about strategic national assets. And so I guess from my point of view, we just saw a clip of the Prime Minister accepting that this probably wouldn't occur today if this sale came up. I just think it's prudent to make a sensible decision to nationalise this particular port. It's an important port. It has been historically important for defence reasons. It's going to be important in the future, no doubt. And I just think it's a prudent, sensible decision to take it back into government hands. And that's not
so just to be clear on this, it is to do with your loss of faith, loss of trust in China, given its other activities over recent years. Is that fair?
Well, no. What I'd say is the general environment, and this is not just a matter for Asia or the Pacific. It's a matter right across the globe, that the rules-based order, that is, nation states acting in a predictable manner according to rules that were set down after the Second World War, is clearly breaking down. And as it's breaking down, every nation has to sensibly review its national security, national interest posture. And I guess I'm not making a criticism necessarily of either the national government at the time or the territory government at the time. I think the territory government was probably operating on a very narrow sort of commercial lens over these things. But I think it's just sensible, now that we have a deteriorating international environment, to take this very important port back into government hands.
OK, but are you really saying this has nothing to do with concerns about China specifically? Well,
I guess what I'm trying to do is put this in a sort of a pretty vanilla sort of language. I think nationalisation makes it an issue of our national sovereignty rather than being an issue of what our friends and allies are doing or what our trading partners are doing. I just think this is a strategically important port, given where it is, given the amount of defence facilities and the like, personnel and the like we have in Darwin. I just think it's sensible and prudent to have this in government hands. It's much more about our own sovereignty, our own peace of mind, rather than being about any other nation. But clearly, you'd have to be deft with the diplomacy. You'd have to be sensible about the way you did it. But I'm not saying it to cause an incident or to get a headline. I'm doing it because I think it's just the prudent and sensible thing to do.
OK, but I'm not sure China would see this in vanilla terms, even if this could be done in a deft diplomatic way. They bought a land bridge. The Chinese company bought this, or took out the 99-year lease on this Port of Darwin. Presumably the commercial transaction was all above board. So what's happened? How would you explain to China why Australia now needs to seize ownership of this port?
Well, from time to time, nations decide to buy critical infrastructure. In 1946, in the wake of World War II, Thomas Playford bought the electricity supply company in South Australia. It was owned by a United Kingdom company at the time. Our diplomatic relations are still good with, the United Kingdom, 70 or 80 years later. So I don't think this needs to be bigger than Ben-Hur. I think you can clearly communicate your national interest to, as I said, not just
but it's no small
partners,
deal either,
friends and allies.
Nick Champion. With respect, I take your point. It doesn't need to be bigger than Ben-Hur, but it's not a trifling matter either.
No, no. And look, I think the most important thing you can do, as we've got a deteriorating international environment, and nearly everybody admits that that's the case, is to be clear about your own national interest, David. And I don't think this is the only asset that, that we have an interest in making sure is in national.
Well, what else is there?
National
so
hands.
What else should we think about nationalising?
Well, I guess, the government of the day should probably be looking at critical infrastructure, and that includes ports and electricity grids and telecommunications. I'd point you to, obviously, the decisions that Labor made around the NBN some 7 or 8 years ago now. These are all important things
so just
for
to pick that up,
to do.
Are you suggesting the federal government should be nationalising all ports, power grids? Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I think what we need to do is have a review, a sensible review of national infrastructure, critical national infrastructure, and make sure that the ownership of this critical national infrastructure operates within the national interest. Now, obviously, different companies, different structures are going to be viewed differently. OK, but you do believe the Port of Darwin is a special case. Why is that? Indeed. Well, because of where it is. Clearly, it's one of the ports that's our gateway to Asia. Second of all, we have this arc of islands to our north, which have always been, and nations to our north, which have always been critical to our national security. And obviously, having a port in that part of the world is also critical to our national security, because from time to time we've had to assist those nations with stability missions, with humanitarian missions, and so it makes sense for what is a critical national asset to be in our Australian government hands. I don't think that's controversial. I don't think it needs to be a matter of, some great dispute diplomatically. On the contrary, I think nations completely understand they have their own national interests, and they assert their national interests in various places. We're called upon to respect that. We're just asking them to respect our national interest. There's the other option would be to build another port near Darwin. There's a proposal there, and the Americans are obviously interested in this as well. What do you think about that? Would that just be too expensive to have a separate port to deal with anything that might be of national security concern? Well, if people think nationalisation is controversial, I would have thought the building of a second port would be even more controversial. I mean, I don't think it wouldn't be in anybody's interest to have two ports in Darwin competing against each other, or maybe complementary, I don't know. But it would seem to me that that would be a more controversial notion than simply nationalising the current port, bringing it back into government hands. That need not be, a bad thing for the company involved who owns the lease at the moment. Our constitution does give property rights to people, so it's not necessarily a bad outcome for them. But what it would be is a good outcome for Australia. And a final one. Did you run this by the Labor leadership group at all, or have you just come up with this yourself? Well, one of the joys of the backbench, David, is you get to, speak your mind on things. I guess I've looked at this situation that's been going on since the sale of the lease some years ago, and watched the government's contortions on it. I mean, we've had the Prime Minister out today basically saying that this lease would not be allowed today under the current rules.